Did any of the following actually happen as described in these scary stories? Welcome to Scary Stories NYC Best of October and November Dogman Stories. We've got 2 hours of scary Dogman stories for you in this episode, but let's start off with an all-new, never-before-heard tale. This one took place in Pennsylvania, over by Pittsburgh, where a lot of Dogman encounters allegedly originate. But this one took place back in the hippie era, which partially explains why we call it I Saw Dogman Throw My Volkswagen. Dear Scary Stories NYC, I was telling a story to my grandson the other day about when I was a hippie back a million years ago. He says my story is actually about the Dogman. I thought it was about a werewolf, and I'd assumed all these years that I had hallucinated the sighting, although I was never able to explain how that hallucination wrecked my wheels, because I saw Dogman throw my Volkswagen Bug. Some people back in the 60s and 70s joined motorcycle gangs. I went to see movies about that, sometimes starring Peter Fonda. That wasn't my scene, however. I was more of a nomadic peace hippie. We had started out as a musical act, then sort of fell off the radar and the grid at the same time. From summer 1969 through Christmas 1971, the group of us drove around together in our 2 VW Beetles and 1 VW van, and we slept in and around our vehicles wherever it looked legal to position ourselves. We did get bothered by the law frequently, but we never got searched as we had heard horror stories about. We had sort of been warned by fellow travelers what counties to avoid, plus we got lucky on multiple occasions, so that we had a mellow time, almost all the time. It was when we began to think that we ourselves were responsible for our good luck that our hubris broke us down and tore us apart. By the later 1970s, we had all become angrier, less happy versions of our parents, and all of our experimentation and high hopes were dashed in a somewhat humiliating way. But for those 2 years, we managed to live free almost all the time. Whenever we would run out of money, an opportunity to get more would fall in our lap. When we felt unwelcome in one area, we'd go off and camp in the woods for a while. In the late spring or early summer of 1971, we sort of merged with this other group of post-hippie nomads similar to ourselves. There were a few more of them than there were of us when we first melded together, and by the end of the summer, the men and women in both our tribes had intermarried, and then left our collective to go off and form families and tribes of their own. Some of them literally got married, others of them just got apartments, but in either sense, the group of us fell away from each other through the autumn. Those of us not already paired off went back to our families that holiday season, and other than a few reunions, that period of our life was permanently over. In that time, though, 1969 through 1971, we had a number of supernatural experiences, especially if you include all the people that were ever with us. Like, for instance, there was this one girl that was only traveling with us for I think 5 weeks or 6, but she would have weird things happen around her all the time. Once, we were having a kind of a picnic in the middle of a field on a sunny day, and then we each began having acorns drop directly down on the tops of our heads. We all looked at that girl. We knew it had something to do with her. We were nowhere near any kinds of trees, whether oak or otherwise, and if that was someone throwing them at us from the woods, it must have been Tom Seaver, because He had great control on his fastball. Also, the acorns were hot to the touch when you would pick them up off the ground. That girl also attracted a ghost to our campsite one time. I remember she saw it in the tree line and screamed, but the thing is that I could see it as well and some of the others too. It looked like a person, but it also seemed to sort of glow. And instead of walking away, it dissolved, like it had been dropped into water or something. Before that girl left us and moved on, I had already begun to have an odd connection to her. The second before she would scream about something scary happening, I would feel it in my belly. It was a kind of excitement, but also a kind of nervousness, and I would feel it below my stomach in my gut. Each time I had that feeling, the girl would scream in the next second, and then we would all run to go see what wonder she had attracted this time. So as you can imagine, after traveling with these people for months and months and months, I had stopped seeing the world the way I had seen it before. I was seeing life the way a tribe of modern nomads would see it, as a magical land of signs and portents. We were camped out in a part of southwestern Pennsylvania, up in the woods on the side of a mountain. We could see for miles and miles and miles, and we had not seen another human being for months. It was very much like heaven, and we even began to refer to our newfound home as Mount Olympus. Like I said, it was our hubris that ultimately brought us down. We began to feel invulnerable. We had really just been on a winning streak, but we thought we had managed to live free for so long because we deserved it, or we earned it, or we were the gods, and so we deserved Olympus. We had always moved just before the local law mobilized against us. We had always just missed encountering local criminal organizations and gangs. We had always moved on just before getting arrested for trespassing. We had lived a charmed life, but this was the time when we pushed it too far. We had been enjoying ourselves so much that year on the side of that Pennsylvania mountain, though we neglected to be polite and keep on going before too long. And so that's why that big old werewolf man from on top of the mountain had to come on down and roust us all out. Oh, this is the part where my grandson says I should call the werewolf a Dogman. That's a pretty good name for what the thing looked like, I'll grant you that. The head was more like a wolf or something than a dog, but it was more dog-like than cat-like or bear-like. Honestly, I thought it was a kind of exotic animal, and I'm kind of surprised that it's been so long since this happened, and I never really found out what exactly that thing even was. This was after that supernatural girl had left us. She'd been gone for some time. I had that feeling, though, that feeling in my gut one night as we sat around a campfire, and I looked around in the darkness past the fire for a while. I couldn't see well past the light of the fire, so I got up and I walked a few feet away, staring into the pitch black. It was so dark out that I closed my eyes, and there was no difference in what I was looking at. So I kept my eyes shut for some time, allowing them to adjust. In the meantime, I listened all around me, but the only thing I heard was the sound of my friends laughing and joking behind me at the campfire. It felt as though something were tickling me inside my right ear, like a very slight vibration on that side. It took me a second to recognize it as a growling sound. And I instantly opened my eyes and spun around to see that there was some kind of animal standing next to me that had that wolf-like head I was telling you about before. The head was right there in front of me, like if you're talking to a guy standing right next to you. It was bending down at the shoulders, though, in order to lower its eyes down to my level. I remember it held its arms out at the sides a bit, and that they were extremely long arms. It looked like each of its fingers ended big fish hooks, and that if I tried to run past him on either his left or his right, he would snag me in either case. I screamed bloody murder because I thought that I was looking into the eyes of the creature that was about to end me. I walked backward, away from the werewolf or dogman, and people freaked out, screaming and running in all directions. The dogman or wolfman was so tall, it was so wide, it was so butch, that even all of us together stood no match against it. Of course, we didn't actually band together. We all ran in different directions as the monster advanced into our little settlement. It was then that it just got disgusted and began throwing stuff around. It picked up a burning log and threw it into a tent. You know, that sort of thing. And then, of course, it went over to my Volkswagen and I groaned inside. Hippie and free spirit or not, it had taken me years to pay off that car, and I had hoped to drive it through into the 1980s. The dogman decided otherwise, however, and he lifted that little German automobile over his head like he was hoisting a beach ball. And then he launched it in the general direction of a whole bunch of us. And again, we all took off running in different directions. I felt the wind of my beloved VW Bug as it flew past me, slamming into a large boulder, and then rolling side over side down the mountain. I remember watching that beautiful car turning over and over, getting a little more wrecked as it proceeded loudly downward. It was like a slow-motion movie to me. All of the memories, all being smashed up in front of my eyes. It was as though the entire world faded away and nothing existed except for me and my dear Volkswagen passing away as I watched. I felt the very real connection between us snap, and I am not ashamed to say I wept in that moment. I am, however, ashamed to admit that I had not noticed the immense dogman walking over to me on his hind legs until he barked right in my face. I felt the warm liquid running down my leg as I smelled everything that dogman had eaten for the past 3 weeks. So close was his mouth to me as he barked like an insane thing escaped from Satan's personal torture asylum. Most of us piled in the VW van and we drove out of there in the middle of the night. I remember not being able to see where we were going from the back as one of the others drove us across fields and down ancient dirt paths looking for a paved road to get us the heck out of that place. I assume the others got away, but it was a lot harder to keep in touch back in those days. It wasn't like people had cell phones, and most of us had no permanent address. So if you ask me, is there a very large wolf-like thing that walks on its hind legs, living in the forests south of Pittsburgh? I would say yes. Or at least there was one back in the early 70s. Because it was way, way back then, in that lost hippie era, when I was once heard to proclaim, "I saw Dogman throw my Volkswagen. I saw Dogman throw a rock." Dear Scary Stories NYC. This happened a few years back, just before Halloween time. I remember because I had been at a Halloween party and I had had a really good time. So good, in fact, that I was a bit shy about the idea of driving home. The reason was that I couldn't manage to get my car key in my car door. That's usually a sign that you aren't fit to drive. I remembered that I wasn't actually more than 5 or 6 blocks from home, and I had an idea I could cut through the woods and come out the other side where I lived. So I started walking through the trees in the dark. That wasn't really a very smart or safe thing to do, since I had never, ever walked through those woods before, not even during the daytime. At least it made the situation safer for pedestrians and other drivers out that night, though. So there I was, stumbling through the woods, which were darker and colder than I had anticipated them being. I heard an animal noise I thought was Bigfoot, and I almost died right there on the spot. When I looked, there was a big old owl giving me the evil eye. Even though it turned out to be harmless, the scare had sobered me up a little, and I took greater care the rest of the way. I also began to focus on walking more quietly, as I had a bad feeling that something far worse than a hooting owl might be out there in that dark forest. I thought about going back to the party and begging someone for a lift home, but when I turned around to head back, all I could see was trees. When I turned around again, I wasn't even sure I was facing the correct direction any longer. My heart was beating faster, and I was sweating, which only made me colder until I was shivering. It wasn't that cold a night, but I was cold with fear. When I came through some bushes and saw some movement in the darkness in front of me, I ducked down to hide. Listening, I could hear that something was out there, so I quietly found a better vantage point and got myself a look to see what that was. It seemed at first to be a big man, dressed all in black. He leaned down and picked up a rock in his right hand. Then he did this sidearm or underhanded fling of the rock, and it banged hard off the wall of a house that was there in the woods, a house I hadn't noticed before. It was a run-down and old-looking place, covered in light-colored shingles that showed, even in the dark, exactly how dirty that place was. There was a small area covered in concrete, with the remains of a basketball hoop on it that had somehow been bent and destroyed. I wondered if our car ran into it or what. I never saw a b-ball hoop wrecked in that manner before. There was a basketball lying on the concrete, and the rock that the figure had thrown ricocheted off the wall and landed right near that basketball. It was then that I could see that rock was about the size of a honey-dew melon. It had looked the size of a baseball in the hand of that dark figure, who I now looked for intently in the darkness. Exactly how large was that guy? I found him with my eyes after a few seconds. He was standing with his back to me, and I could see he was broad-shouldered and had pointed ears on top. He looked to me in the darkness like Batman when Frank Miller would draw him. Google it if you don't know what I mean. Really wide, incredibly muscular, and with those bat ears sticking up on top. My mind was spinning. There was a 7 or 8 foot tall Batman throwing melon-sized rocks at a house in the woods that wasn't even by any roads. I mean, it couldn't have even had an address. It was just a house in the woods. To me that night, the house was just as strange a thing to see as the giant rock-throwing Batman guy. But as I watched, that Batman guy turned his head, and I saw him in profile for a few seconds. I couldn't help but gasp as that brief view showed me that he was not Batman. He had a long snout, like a canine. Those weren't bat ears. Those were dog ears. This was an upright standing hairy figure, covered in dark fur that camouflaged it pretty well in the night. It was not an upright standing canine, though, as canines do not have opposable thumbs. Canines can't pick up rocks and throw them. I watched as this creature picked up another rock and threw it at the house, hitting it hard on the side and knocking one of the shingles loose. As interesting as this was, I found it just that much more terrifying. I needed to get home, but there was a werewolf who could throw faster than Nolan Ryan blocking my way. Even if I had been awake and sober, I wouldn't have been sure what to do. So I did what comes naturally to me. I panicked and freaked out. I think I just walked all the way around the monster, but I'll be honest, I've blanked out most of the rest of my walk home. I was never so scared in my life, and I think my mind is doing me a favor by erasing that part from my internal records. I don't even really want to know. Maybe the Dogman chased me. Maybe I was so shaky that I made noise and it confronted me. I just don't remember. I do remember standing on the street in front of my house and someone beeping at me. That's when I realized I was just standing in the middle of the road like a zombie, and I moved out of the car's way so it could pass. So then I stood in front of my house for a while, trying to remember what had just happened. It slowly all came back, as did my sense of panic and my heart beating 1,000,000 times a minute. I got myself inside, I locked up the house, and I drew myself a warm bath to calm myself down. I don't care if you think that's silly. That's what calms me down, so that's what I did. The next day, I was wondering how much of the story was actually true. I mean, I didn't think I had partied so hard that I would hallucinate an imaginary house and a monster, but in the light of the morning, it all seemed so dramatic and impossible. I had a free day, so sometime before lunch, I decided to walk in the woods and see if that house was actually there, or if it had evaporated since the night before, like a pink elephant. Well, it was there all right, and if anything, it looked even scarier in the midday sun, or as much of the midday sun as the tree canopy allowed to filter down. I stood there for a while, like I was looking at a ghost, afraid to step closer. The fear of the night before started creeping back, and I thought about running home. Curiosity got the better of me, though. Was the house still inhabited? It was a 10-minute walk through the woods from my home. If this guy was being attacked by some dog-headed Bigfoot thing, how long until it attacked my house, too? I thought I'd better try to meet whoever lived in that house. He or she or they might have information for me about what that thing was. Maybe they could save me a lot of trouble down the line. Or maybe I could help them out right now. I gathered my courage. What could it hurt to knock on the door? If they didn't want to talk, I'd have lost nothing. But if they were willing to explain what they knew about that monster thing, that could prove invaluable to me. I was probably as afraid of that house as I was of the Dogman, but I walked up to it anyway, shouting, "Hello?" I went slowly, repeating my questioning hello as I went. "Is anybody home?" I took one step on the wooden porch of the place, and the front door slammed open, revealing a very angry-looking old white-haired man wearing ripped-up boxer trunks and carrying a rusty old Winchester. "Keep your feet off my property, mister," he said threateningly. I backed up a few steps with my hands in the air, and I basically blurted out everything I've just told you. I was walking home through the woods. I saw the Dogman throw the 2 rocks. He stared at me long and hard, and I wondered if he was going to say anything at all. Finally, he asked me why in God's name I had come out there to tell him that. I explained that I was a neighbor. I lived just a 10-minute walk away. If he had a Dogman problem, then I had a Dogman problem. Maybe I could help out in some way, and maybe in exchange he could tell me what he knew about the creature. Was it a werewolf? A long-snouted Bigfoot? I mean, what was that thing? Laughing, he finally let down his guard and told me it was nothing for me to worry about. "Just don't trespass on my property, and no trouble will come your way," he said, turning around and walking back inside. I tried to ask more questions, but he ignored me and slammed the door behind himself. I knew better than to try again. I just walked home. But the whole situation kept nagging at me. I had only lived out there a few years at that point. I began making better friends with my neighbors, especially the ones who had been there for a long time. The elderly lady down the street told me that man was cursed. I almost laughed, but I could see she wasn't joking. She went on to tell me a sad story of how, when he was a young man, he and his wife had been partying, and they got in an accident on the way home. His wife didn't survive, and her family, it is said, put a curse on the man. Supposedly, his house was haunted. He had poltergeists, according to the lady. I told her that I saw a werewolf outside his house, and she looked unsurprised. I asked her how the family put a curse on him, and she shrugged her shoulders. Some people bring wealth with them from the old country, she said. Other people bring their magic. Waving goodbye to me and smiling, she went inside, terminating the conversation. I admit it's literally an old wives' tale, but her story did mesh well with what the old man said to me. Just stay off his property and I'd be fine. That's because the family cursed him, not the town. The Dogman only bothered him. But where did it go the rest of the time? I was extra spooked by all this because I had been considering driving home that night. Let's face it, if I had gotten my keys in that ignition, I would have. It gives me the shudders now how I ever could have even considered it. I almost feel like the Dogman appeared to me on purpose, as a kind of a warning. It's been years since then, and I'm not going to act like this experience brought on massive and sweeping changes in my life. But one thing has changed. I plan ahead in terms of cabs or designated drivers. So I think I'm just a little more cautious and a little more conscious since the night that I saw Dogman throw a rock. Our executive producer, Thomas Cox. He's who rules and he's who rocks. He's the baddest guy in 100 blocks. Our executive producer, Thomas Cox. Please join us in thanking Thomas Cox for making this episode possible. He's no relation to our executive producer Timothy from yesterday. If you'd like to become a Scary Stories executive producer like Thomas Cox and see our secret uncensored episodes, stay tuned and Dr. Death will explain how right after this next story, which we call My Son Sees Wile E. Coyote Outside His Window. Dear Scary Stories NYC, my wife and I bought an old fixer-upper house out in the country when we found out that we had a son on the way. Because the downstairs was less in need of repair than the upstairs, we decided to have our bedroom on the first floor. After a couple or 3 years, the house was pretty well in a livable state, but we kept our bedroom downstairs anyway, just because we had gotten used to it. When Tyler, not his real name, was old enough to have his own room, we gave him the one next to ours downstairs. We were on the side in the back, but his room gave a view out toward the backyard and the trees leading to our neighbor's property. One of the things about Tyler back then was that we could sometimes hear him laughing and giggling in there in the night. We were glad that he was so happy in his own room because we had been concerned he might be afraid without us nearby. So when he would laugh, we would too, and we thought everything was all right in our world. Then one morning over breakfast, it sounded like he was telling us that Wile E. Coyote from the Roadrunner cartoons was outside his window the night before. He was pronouncing it Wile Coyote, so I was only 85% sure that was what he meant. Kids say weird things sometimes, so I wasn't upset or scared to hear it. My wife couldn't translate it into adultese any better than I could, and it nagged at me. I couldn't just let it drop. Somehow it felt like I had better understand what he was trying to tell me, even if it turned out to be him telling me about some TV show he saw or a dream or an imaginary friend. I didn't want to press the kid too much because sometimes if you keep questioning them, they take that as an excuse to make up a wild story. Then I'd be helping to make a mountain out of a molehill. I said something like, well, it sounds like last night was a very special night then if Wally Coyote was outside, which caused Tyler to burst into rude laughter directed at me. There's nothing special about Wally Coyote being outside. He lives outside, Dad. Obviously, I deserved the mocking. I could not argue with the kid's logic. I asked him if he's laughing at Wally Coyote at night when we hear him laughing from the next room. His face looked a blank, kind of confused. Of course it did. He had no idea when we heard him laughing. That wasn't his experience. I tried asking him if Wally was funny to him, but he got shy and looked around as if hoping somebody would change the subject. Still, I had a theory building. Either our son had a nighttime imaginary friend, or else he really was seeing something that reminded him of that cartoon character. My sister-in-law is a child psychologist, so of course we had a conversation with her about it. She advised us to keep our ears open if he talked about it anymore, but to be extra careful not to ask leading questions. If he began to feel he could get attention for making up stories, he might start doing it just to get attention. And the next thing you know, he'd end up having a scary stories channel on YouTube. No, she didn't really say that last part. I'm just kidding. My wife and I talked about it, and she was far less alarmed than I was. She was convinced it was just the boy's imagination. I felt she was probably right, but what about the 1 in a million chance that he was actually telling us something that we should be paying attention to? What if he was just giving us a kid's explanation for something that wasn't cute or funny at all? One night, I was coming back to my bedroom from the bathroom and I heard Tyler giggling in his bedroom. I opened the door quickly and I peeked inside, where I saw him standing on his bed and waving out the window. Outside. To my horror, I saw something in the shadows walking away. I only saw it for a second, but it looked like something from Donnie Darko, like a demented furry from a nightmare. I did not see the head. I saw a furry torso and weird-looking furry legs with a short, stubby tail. And I saw him exiting stage left. I burst into the room looking at the window to try to see more of it, but I could not. I flung the window and the shade up. I stuck my head out, but there was nothing more to see. Closing and locking the windows, I told Tyler we were going to have some fun and sleep upstairs in one of our guest rooms. After I got him settled down with some of his best stuffed doll friends, my wife and I called the police and reported a prowler on our property. They came and searched around but found nothing, and they suggested we take some security measures. The next day, I got a bunch of motion-activated cameras, and we soon put in an alarm system, which doesn't really work. We're going to replace that soon. My wife and I took the upstairs bedroom that was meant to be the master bedroom, and Tyler is next door. We all feel a lot safer up on the second floor. I checked the trap cams every week, but we haven't caught anything other than raccoons and deer and things you would expect to get pictures of. And yet, on some nights, I still hear my son laughing in his room in the middle of the night. Dogman? On horseback? Dear Scary Stories NYC. I grew up on a ranch as an adopted son of a family who owned 4 horses. I had mainly been adopted by the mother of the family, and after she passed, and my adopted father remarried, his new wife never took to me. I was left out of any wills, which was fine. I wasn't a blood relative after all. I'm just grateful to have been given a largely peaceful childhood, where I attended good schools and made some good friends. I'm rarely invited to the family home any longer, but my mind goes back to a time when I was placed in charge of the horses. That was the time when I saw the Dogman. That horrible thing was an omen, although I didn't want to accept it at the time. Once I saw that monster, things got worse and worse in my life. The Dogman is like something from hell. You don't want to see that thing, trust me. He made his presence known long before any of us saw him, though. I got up one morning to find all 4 horses out, running around. It took until afternoon for me to catch them all, and I was forced to do this by myself, since I was blamed for the entire incident. I made sure that they were all securely locked up the next night, tied into their stables, but when I checked on the horses in the morning, one of them was completely missing, and the other 3 seemed quite unhappy and nervous. The horse that was gone was my adopted father's favorite, and he was already very unhappy with me. I knew for a fact that none of the horses could have possibly gotten out of their stables by themselves, and that it would have been difficult to break in. I used a thick rope and tied it tight, using a knot I learned in the Boy Scouts. The rope for the stable that had been broken into was not untied. It had been ripped or cut somehow. Someone, or something, had been in the stable and had let the horse free. I didn't know if my dad would care, but I knew it wasn't my fault. This was a horse thief. I saw no blood on the ground, so I didn't think the horse was attacked, just stolen. However, I did see big old dog prints around everywhere. None of us had thought to look for prints the day earlier. Everyone had blamed me, and I had been too busy rounding them all back up to be thinking that it was sabotage. But now I knew that an outside party was involved, so at least I was beginning to have an idea of what was going on. I grabbed a weapon and some ammunition, and I mounted the fastest of the remaining horses. Then the 2 of us took off down the trail, which was the most likely way they must have left our property. We ran at top speed for a while, as I figured they must have a very large lead on us. We ran until the horse was tired. I stopped by a stream to allow him to drink and to cool down for a while. I felt so deeply sad, not because I was going to be in trouble, but because I should have realized that the horses couldn't all get out by themselves the night before. It was obvious in retrospect that someone was messing with us. I should have camped out near the stables and protected the horses all night, but I was too busy feeling sorry for myself and hating myself for being stupid and all the other things that they were calling me. I knew they were wrong, but I still internalized their insults. Because of my selfishness and self-loathing, we might never see that sweet, fine horse ever again. I felt like crying, but crying instead of taking logical action is what got me into this situation in the first place, so I resisted. I closed my eyes, and I listened to the horse drinking, the birds twittering, the wind blowing, and then I heard a rumbling sound. Opening my eyes, I looked around for storm clouds. No, the rumbling was still happening, and it was coming from my left. Looking down the road, I could see a cloud of dust approaching from the distance. Adrenaline coursed through me, and I could practically hear the horror movie music playing in the background. That was something coming our way. That was not a friend of ours. That was something scary as hell. That was something that meant trouble. I mounted that horse as quickly as I could, and by the time I was on top, the cause of that rumbling, the cause of that approaching whirlwind of smoke and dust, was already too close for us to attempt to run away from it. Instead, I sat in my saddle, hands shaking, heart pumping, and I saw that it was, in fact, my father's favorite horse approaching, but running faster and more insanely than I had ever seen him run before. He ran like the devil himself was riding him. In the next second, my horse whinnied and reared back in horror as we both saw that devil riding on horseback. It was a dark, hairy devil, larger than any man and yet looking very much like a hairy, fur-covered man. His back legs, which clung tightly to either side of the horse, were not a man's legs. They were bent all backward like a devil's legs should be. Its face was hideous, like that of a jackal, not a human, and the horns on its head moved as I watched him thunder past, so I understood they were ears, as in dog ears, not actually horns. It was a jackal-headed hairy demon, and it was riding my father's horse, like they were competing in the Kentucky Derby. I was truly dazed and zombie-like as I rode my horse home. We did not run. We did not gallop. We just went home. I wasn't in a particular rush to be there, to be honest. I didn't even want to guess at what I would see when I got there. I actually had a question in my head. What do I tell them happened? But I shooed it away, deciding to just tell the truth. I might get called a liar, but it would be easier to keep my story straight if I didn't have any story to keep straight. When I got back to the family ranch, I was more surprised by what I saw than I had expected to be. The horse was there. It was just standing by the stables. The Dogman was nowhere to be seen. I jumped off the horse I was riding and ran toward my father's favorite. Then I realized what I'd done and I ran back to the other, grabbing the reins before it took off, and soon I had all the horses back in their places. When my adopted father came out to the stables, I told him the truth right off, showing him how the rope had been torn into on the one stable, proving someone had broken in. He examined the rope and was confused. It didn't look cut, so much as torn, and that didn't make sense. At least he didn't expect me of doing it. I offered to camp out by the stables to protect the horses, and Dad agreed, but told me it was just a temporary situation until he put together some more permanent security plan. 3.5 years later, I was still camping out by the stables when I was informed that Dad's new wife was selling the horses to a glue farm and renting out my bedroom, so I had to find another place to live. Things can change fast in life, and you have to just remain grateful and roll with the punches. Sure, you can be upset about it when things go wrong, but then you feel bad, plus things have still gone wrong. It's like doubling your problems if you let them get you down. Plus, it's selfish, because then you neglect the needs of others around you. That Dogman would never have taken that horse out for a joyride if I had been more responsible and less self-pitying. I may have had to start my life over when the horses and I all got evicted that one harsh night, but I'm still happy for the time I spent there. After all, how many people can truly say that they saw Dogman on horseback? What can one say about our Mr. Daniel? If he is a beach, then I'm but a granule. Better than Groucho and Harpo and Chico. Today's executive producer is Daniel D'Amico. I know you Marx Brothers fans are cringing. His name is pronounced Chico. Well, you rhyme, D'Amico, I dare you. I already used Andre Gromyko last time. Please join me in thanking Daniel D'Amico, who made this episode possible. If you would like to become a Scary Stories executive producer, just join our paid subscribers club at peterbernard.com or click the join link under this video. And now, for a story that's actually about New York City for a change. And we call it A Werewolf in Staten Island. Dear Scary Stories NYC. People think of New York City as dirty, grimy, overpopulated, and very, very urban. A lot of it is actually like that, but the city is so large that it can also incorporate massive wild areas. At the time when it was planned out, this was fortunately viewed as a priority. We are graced with Central Park, but we have a number of natural areas larger than that. And in one particular area, we have enough land that, in my opinion at least, we can sustain a small population of the Dogman. This story happened around 10 years ago when I used to live in Staten Island. If you don't know, Staten Island is the southernmost borough of New York City. It's a lot closer to New Jersey, to be honest. I think the two states had a bet and New York lost. I mean won. My first serious girlfriend that I wanted to live with was from Staten Island. When I started talking about us getting a place together, she thought I meant in Heartland Village where she grew up. Now, Heartland Village is in Staten Island, and it's a half-hour drive from the Staten Island ferry. The ferry takes a half hour once it finally leaves. Then, and only then, can you actually start heading to work or wherever you need to go. I couldn't believe that my girlfriend, let's call her Stella, would actually travel for an hour each day just to begin traveling to work. I had lived in the East Village since I'd gotten my first good-paying job. I had to have a roommate, but I could walk to work in 20 minutes. When I was talking to Stella about us moving in together, I meant someplace logical, someplace in the city, not in freaking New Jersey. I was disgusted, but I was in love, and eventually we compromised. We got an apartment in St. George, which is in Staten Island, but right near the ferry. So this way I was only adding around an extra 45 minutes to my day in the morning and the same at night for no reason. The rents weren't at all cheaper, but the apartment we got was larger than we could have afforded in the city. I spent my days wandering to the shoreline and staring back at Lower Manhattan, wishing I were dating a sane woman that would let me go home. Meanwhile, she thought St. George was too downtown. The Staten Island Yankees, a minor league affiliate of the real Yankees, played a few minutes' walk away from us, and on their game days, the neighborhood could get fairly crowded. Stella was used to living where people drove to the store, then drove home, and if you passed someone out walking in either direction, you honked at them and screamed because why would that weirdo be out walking? Stella didn't like weirdos in her neighborhood, and in St. George, as far as she was concerned, she saw weirdos wherever she looked. The St. George Theater brought musical acts to the neighborhood, including all their fans, taking the ferry across the Merciless to leave garbage everywhere, then go home. To my home. My former home, anyway. So, both I and my girlfriend felt like fish out of water, and we began bickering with each other. We weren't smart enough to break up, though. When I got a raise at my job, Stella talked me into buying a car with her. I didn't even have a driver's license, but suddenly I was being pressured to take driving lessons because she wanted a car. We only ever used the car to drive to her mother's. They stopped allowing cars on the ferry years ago. Biggest waste of my money a woman had made up to that point, and the resentments were growing on both sides. One night, she got a call on our landline. Remember those? It was a call from her mom insisting she was depressed and lonely. It was her husband's bowling night and she had nothing to do. Stella told her that we would drive out and keep her company without asking me first if that was okay. When she hung up, I got a lecture that if I don't care about her mother's depression, then that's the same as putting a bullet in my girlfriend's heart. It was really overdramatic, and so I gave up, and I brought my laptop with me to try to get some work done. During our mission of mercy, we drove south using local roads, no highways. For Stella, she was a Staten Island native, and she knew every part of it like the back of her hand. I tried at first to work on my computer, but the roads were so bumpy that I was getting seasick, and I almost dropped the laptop twice. So I tossed it in the back seat and just contented myself to watch our ride out the window, the same way I used to when I was riding in the back of my parents' car to visit a relative. Only this time, it was dark out, and I had no advance warning that this is what I was going to be doing that night. She ended up taking Manor Road, which is a long, twisty, windy, narrow road that passes through what to me always looked like the stories I had heard about jungle habitat. I learned long ago that I'm not allowed to make jokes about how the place looks like Bigfoot is going to cross the road at any second. That would make my girlfriend angry. With places named things like Bloodroot Valley and Moses Mountain, you'd think you're down in Appalachia. That part of Staten Island is one park connected to another park connected to another, together forming this huge landmass of nature in the middle of the borough. It's literally large enough to sustain its own population of white-tailed deer. That's no joke. There are snapping turtles, there are frogs, rabbits, chipmunks, and salamanders living in the greenbelt. That's what the area is called. It's a jungle in the middle of a collection of urban and suburban neighborhoods, and I doubt there's any place else like it in the United States. That's where we were driving through, and I had a sense of foreboding about it. Well, of course, I always did. Like I mentioned, the place gave me the creeps, and I really expected to see Bigfoot every time we drove down there. I also mentioned earlier that I learned to keep my mouth shut about it too. Stella didn't like anyone to talk to her while she was driving. She was very nervous about the entire thing. She told me driving through nature calmed her because there were fewer pedestrians. She was always convinced she was gonna hit a pedestrian. If you think that way, you should really let someone else drive. Of course, I refused to take lessons or get a license, so Stella drove. Nervously. I don't know if it was my imagination, but it seemed like Stella was experiencing the same sense of dread that I was. This night was somehow different from the other times we had been through that place. I thought the thought, this night is the night when something is gonna happen. And then, bam, straight in front of us, something huge and hairy leaped onto the road in front of us, and I screamed. "Look out!" Stella swerved left into the lane for oncoming traffic to avoid hitting the creature. This was a four-legged creature, mind you, and it looked like an immense wolf. Dire wolf is the term that popped into my head because I had been reading about them back then. I don't really think that's what it was, though. This was an oversized black wolf with white and tan trimmings on his fur. He wasn't a normal wolf. There was something about his eyes and something about his mouth that seemed sort of primitive to me. His teeth were almost too big to fit in that mouth. It was nearly saber-toothed, but it was canine in appearance, not feline. The creature took up 2/3 of the road, but Stella snuck past him all the way on the left. There was no traffic coming toward us, and she had all the road in front of her to maneuver in. But somehow the crazy maneuvering she had done had succeeded in turning the car engine off. We sat there, unmoving, engine off, headlights off. We were in the wrong lane in the dark, and when traffic came our way, something bad was gonna happen. Meanwhile, I turned and watched behind us as the huge, dark wolf had noticed our situation, and he became interested. Apparently, when interested in something, this creature stands up on his hind legs, and then he strolls over to investigate. I learned all this by observing the creature rise to a bipedal posture, standing so tall that I could only see his lower half through the back window as he approached us. I tried to urge Stella to turn the engine back on, but she shouted at me that it wouldn't work. I tried again to stress that we should be trying to leave that place, and she informed me loudly that it was her car, and she knew how to drive it. She asked me if I wanted to drive and then sat there as though waiting for me to actually answer. She said if she didn't wait long enough before trying the engine again, it was just gonna get flooded. She went on and on and on while I was watching the bottom half of an upright walking giant dog coming closer and closer and closer to us. Finally, I thought I was gonna wet myself. I was so scared, and I interrupted her to scream that the Dogman was coming for us. I guess she actually hadn't realized that before, because she shut up and she turned the key in the ignition, which did not start the engine. I asked her to try it again, and she began lecturing me again about how she needed to wait a certain amount of time. Then the Dogman leaned down, looking into the car from inches outside the passenger window, maybe half a foot from my face. And I admit, I passed out from fear. When I woke up, Stella says the first thing I did was I asked if I was dead, and if I was this heaven or hell? I don't remember any of that. She told me that the car started the next time she turned the engine on, and that she sped off, but the dogman had chased her all the way down Manor Road, then made the right turn with her onto Rockland Avenue before some oncoming headlights finally seemed to scare the thing off. I shuddered at the idea. If that traffic had come a few minutes earlier, we might both have been goners by then. Stella's makeup was running down her face, and I could see she had been really scared back there. Boy, was I lucky that I fainted. Boy, was I smart not to get a driver's license. She probably would have forced me to drive that night, and then I would have probably flooded the engine. After I broke up with that girl, it took me almost 8 years to get back into the city where I belong. Since then, I have rules about not dating girls from the boroughs. You can't tell me that New York is New York and that the neighborhood doesn't matter. That's completely untrue. If you're not in Manhattan or certain parts of Brooklyn, then you're more of an American than a New Yorker. I don't mean anything bad by the remark, and I'll explain why I said it. I said it because there's never been a Dogman sighting in Manhattan. But I saw with my own eyes a werewolf in Staten Island. I saw the Pennsylvania dog squatch. Dear Scary Stories NYC, my buddy we can call Trigger and I saw what we are calling a dog squatch, and I'm going to tell you all about it. I can't reveal my real name because I would get canceled from my job. My boss is very against the idea of monsters, or the paranormal, or even theories about JFK. You've got to keep it in the mainstream to work for this guy, so I'm not going to be able to write my book about this experience until I get a boss who's cool about these kind of things. In the meantime, I can tell you what happened, and I can tell you exactly where it happened, too. We were driving east and south through Acme, Pennsylvania, on the old Country Line Road. I remember we had passed Chestnut Ridge Park, and it was really dark out. This was a couple or 3 weeks ago, and the leaves were changing color, making it feel really creepy and Halloween-y. Trigger was going on and on about how there used to be a whole family of Bigfoot living right in these very woods, but now there's only one of them left. I think he was just making it all up to see if he could get me scared. I tried to act like it wasn't working, but in actuality, he was kind of freaking me out. I breathed a sigh of relief when we came upon some private homes on our right. They looked cozy and festive, at least by 2020 standards. They reminded me of the home I grew up in, and a feeling of all-encompassing warmth and safety pervaded my world. No matter how scared Trig was trying to make me feel, I was driving through a nice neighborhood out in the suburbs, and there wasn't really anything to fear. And then, as though reality itself had heard my thoughts and decided to prank me personally, a big, hairy monster walked out of the side yard of one of those sweet-looking family homes and strode right out onto Country Line Road in front of us. Now, you might say this was just the power of suggestion, because my friend had just been claiming that we had one old bull Sasquatch still alive in the woods around there. And you know what? You might be right, but this thing did not look like a hallucination. He did, however, look like a nightmare. Yes, it was a Sasquatch, and yet, no, it wasn't one. I mean, the feet that slapped down hard on that 2-lane blacktop that night sure looked like giant, wide, human-type feet. They certainly looked like the feet of a Bigfoot, as so often depicted in documentaries and fiction alike. They were attached to ultra-thick, tree-trunk-sized legs, as you would expect as well. The thing was pretty much the exact model of a Bigfoot, except that once you got up to its broad, man-like chest. It was hunched over a bit, its hands ending in long, sharp talons, and its head far more closely resembling that of a timber wolf than anything Bobo from that old TV show would think was squatchy. The ears were not Sasquatch ears. The eyes did not have a significant brow ridge over them, and the mouth was combined with a long, canine snout. I don't think this was either a Dogman or a Bigfoot in the conventional sense. I think this was something possibly a result of parallel evolution that only appeared to resemble one or the other. Either a canine species had adapted to that kind of thick, upright body, or else a Bigfoot or bear species adapted to having that wolf-like head. At least, that's my gut feeling about it. I'm not a scientist, though, so, it's just a personal opinion. Trigger wants me to include his ideas about it, even though I think they're kind of weird. Trig says this monster was to Dogman what the creature walks among us was to the creature from the Black Lagoon. Now, I know what he means, but if you aren't a monster movie nerd like us, then you might be lost, so I'll explain. The creature from the Black Lagoon was a thin monster with a swimmer's physique. In the third installment of his series of films, they capture the creature and they operate on him, allowing him to breathe through lungs instead of gills. He can't breathe underwater any longer, he's an air breather now. But for some reason, giving him lungs made him extremely tall and chubby, with the build of a professional wrestler instead of a swimmer. Well, that's what Trigger's trying to say. If the Dogman is known for being a thin, dog-legged monster, the one we saw was the wider, bigger, professional wrestling version of a Dogman. The fur was very light all over, either white or light gray or possibly blonde. It was hard to tell in the night, but this was some lighter shade. I don't think it was an albino, as I seem to recall the nose being darker than the rest of it. It didn't actually look in our direction, though, so I can't be 100% sure of that. When I saw the big man thing walk out onto the highway, I slammed on the brakes right away, of course. It was across the street and into the thick woods before I got to where he would have been, though, so I didn't even need to slow down. I don't think it took more than 2 or 3 steps total to be back under tree cover, and that's a road that's more than 2 cars wide. Think about how long its legs must have been. In my memory, I remember him seeming an absurdly tall height, but that could have been an illusion caused by the surprise of the sighting. I mean, to call it unexpected would be a major understatement. Neither of us have any specific memory of the dog-headed Bigfoot standing directly next to anything that we could go back and measure, so we don't really know how big it was. It seemed twice the size of any man, though. It seemed like it was 10 feet taller, as absurd as that sounds. And I'm talking about it being that tall while hunched over at the shoulders in that weird werewolf way that it had. In the reports of Dogman that I'm finding online, these things have dog-like legs which they walk on. This one had human-like legs, or at least Bigfoot legs. They were not canine. It also seemed to have hands, as in 3 or 4 fingers and a thumb ending in claws. That's not really a Bigfoot thing to have claws, and it's not a canine thing to have thumbs. As far as Trigger and I are concerned, what we saw was a dog squatch. If you know about any other sightings of something like this, under any name, please leave info in the comments for this video. I would like to know if others have seen this, and if so, where, and what do they call it? Until then, Trig and I will have to make ourselves content with the fact that we've seen something very rare. And it's even possible we're the only 2 guys in the world right now who can claim, I saw the Pennsylvania dog squatch. Bradley Poole, the interlooper, more badass than a real state trooper. You know he's the king of cool. I'm talking about that Bradley Poole. Please join me in thanking Bradley Poole, the king of cool, executive producer of this episode. If you would like to be as cool as Bradley Poole, just join our paid subscribers club at peterbernard.com or click the join button underneath this video. Then you'll gain access to our secret uncensored stories, which Dr. Death will tell you more about at the end of this show. In our last episode, we had a story about a guy who was born a half hour after Halloween. That's actually what happened to me as well. I was born around 12:35 a.m. on November 1st, just barely missing being a Halloween baby. But still, I love this time of year, and I understand why some people have a very sentimental attachment to the holiday. Take the guy who sent us this next story, for example. He would like to tell us my personal Halloween story of my mother and Dogman. Dear Scary Stories NYC. When I was a kid, I would go trick-or-treating with all of the other kids, but my favorite part was afterward, when I got back home. My mother would wrap me in this big old blanket, then tell me scary stories all night, way past my usual bedtime. It was our personal Halloween thing to do, and we loved Halloween, even more than Christmas. When I was 12, my mom got sick and was in the hospital. They didn't really explain to me how bad it was, and I wasn't brought to see her. On Halloween, I wanted her to either come home, or I wanted to go to the hospital so that we could have our Halloween together. Instead, they sent me to bed early. This didn't sit right with me. I was furious that I was being kept from my mom on our favorite night of the year. I didn't feel as though other random adults could overrule my mother, so I snuck out, and I headed into the forest. I had the idea that the hospital was somewhere on the other side of those woods. It was, but it was about 20 miles past the forest, not anywhere close. Even for my age, it was a stupid and childish decision I made, and I really should have perished that night. That's what I was really asking for, and by all rights, that was what I should have received. It was a lot colder out than I had anticipated. I mean, not at first, but after a long time of walking through the woods, I was starting to shiver. I also wasn't really very certain what direction I was heading in after a while. The growing realization that I didn't actually know where the hospital was, coupled with the fact that I hadn't expected this forest to be so large, combined to make me feel a whole lot less confident in my decision to be where I was. I thought about heading back home, but by then I honestly couldn't be certain which way back even was. Attempting to continue in the direction I had been, time passed, and body heat drained out of me. I began to feel tired, and I wished I could be in bed, under my warm blankets. Really, I wished I could be wrapped in that big old blanket being told scary stories by my mother. This was Halloween. This was our night. And yet there I was, alone in the forest, freezing, miles away from wherever she might be. I started to feel very sorry for myself, and I started to cry and feel very frightened. I even cried out for help to find out if there was anybody nearby. I hoped maybe I was behind someone's backyard or something, that possibly I wasn't out as deep in the woods as I had thought. But no human beings responded to my cry for help. I think I was being stalked for a long while before I understood that was what was happening. There was a bad odor that I noticed before I heard the thing out there in the darkness. It smelled like the zoo. At first, I just thought it was sort of funny that the forest smelled like the zoo. It took me a while to think that, well, maybe there's a large animal nearby. I guess I thought it was the dirt and the trees that were giving off that pungent aroma of decay. When I finally heard something moving branches away that were way over my head, it all coalesced into an understanding of the reality I was now facing. I would like to say that I enacted a brilliant plan to flush my stalker out of hiding and force him or her to reveal their true identity. I would like to say that, but it would be a flat-out lie, as what I really did was freeze on that spot. I didn't know what to do or where to go, and so I froze right there in a moment of sheer indecisiveness. And then my pursuer burst forth from the trees, and the sight of that thing was so repellent and utterly horrifying that my legs started running away on their own. I didn't have to think about anything any longer. My body had overruled my mind and was trying to remove all of us from imminent danger. I can't blame my reflexes and instincts from calling martial law in that moment, because what my eyes had just witnessed was something that kind of shut down my thinking mind for a period of time. It was like it knocked my consciousness offline or something. Temporarily, but long enough that I'd have been a goner if I had stayed there for even 1 second longer than I did. It would be easy to just tell you that what I saw was a dogman, or a werewolf, or maybe a skinwalker, or brujo, or sorcerer, or tulpa, or projection, or mythic archetype, but you know what? Any of those words would be presumptuous in this context. I can only describe what I saw. I can't explain what it was, or how it got there. What I saw was about the size of a tall man, but not a giant man. He wasn't 8 or 9 feet tall, but he was probably over 6. He was quick and limber, and seemed very strong, but bony at the same time. His wrists and joints seemed enlarged, but his quick movements certainly didn't make him seem arthritic. He looked intelligent to me, but his eyes were not at all human. The creature most closely resembled a wolf from an old cartoon, standing up on its hind legs, its long, toothy snout drooling as its hungry eyes looked me over. Its fur was a bright and very dark red color, different from any fur I'd ever seen before in my life. In spite of all that, the eyes were the most memorable part. They just seemed to glow somehow. I ran like a crazy person. I had never felt such complete, ice-cold fear before. I knew I wasn't faster than the wolf, but I knew I was smaller, so I ducked down under and through things, hoping to lose him or send him off chasing in the wrong direction. I ran past an old tree with a huge cavity rotted out of its massive, ancient trunk. I ran back and dove inside, trying to hide myself down as deep in the wet, nasty, bug-filled old rotting trunk as I could. After a few minutes, I heard someone or something approaching, and my heart began beating so loudly I thought it could be heard outside of my hiding spot. I felt like screaming as I heard whoever or whatever it was approach, and I got the shock of my life when I looked up and out of that trunk, and I saw my mother. Somehow she had located me out lost in the woods. It was an extremely moving moment, our tearful reunion. You could probably imagine. Amazingly, she had brought me my blanket from home. She covered me in it, making my hiding spot less cold and less damp. She told me to keep it over my head and remain quiet, and then the dogman wouldn't find me there. I did as she instructed, and then I guess I fell asleep. I felt a tapping on the blanket which woke me up. Then came the sound of my mother telling me the coast was clear. I squinted and blinked into the bright sunlight. I must have slept through to the morning. Climbing out of the tree, my covering got stuck on something inside the trunk. My mother said she'd take care of the blanket and pointed out the way I should go to get back home. It was surprisingly easy to get home from there. I couldn't believe it either then or now. I walked in the back door of the house, which leads to the kitchen, and I nearly gave my aunt a heart attack. She didn't even know I wasn't up in my bed. The adults had just assumed I'd been up there all night. That confused me, though. If they never knew I was gone, then who told my mother to go looking for me in the forest? It just didn't make any sense. Someone had to have noticed I wasn't in my bed. My aunt got 2 of the other adults who had been staying over, and they all asked me where I had been and what I had been doing. I told them the truth. I had left in the night to go to the hospital and spend Halloween with my mom. Then I got chased by a dogman who looked like he was probably going to eat me. My uncle asked me to leave out the comic book stuff and just tell them the truth about where I was. I resented that, since I had been being honest with them before that insult. Again, I didn't respect the authority of these people, and I found them rude. It took me some time before I was willing to give them any more information. Finally, I relented. I told them how my mother had covered me with my blanket, and that she had helped me survive being stalked by the dogman. They looked shocked and physically ill when I said that part. I asked them what was wrong, and my uncle told me my story was impossible. My mother couldn't have saved me from the dogman. My mother had died at the hospital the night before. Waking up to the Dogman. Dear Scary Stories NYC, I had some strange experiences when I moved into my new house last year. I do mean new in a literal sense, as I was the first occupant of the place. Obviously, it had no history of being haunted that anyone knew about, since it had only ever been a patch of land in the woods as far as anyone knew. Yet, when I sold the place earlier this year, I felt compelled to tell the next owner why I wanted to unload it so quickly. He thought I was just crazy, and he laughed off my warnings. That's fine with me. I would have felt guilty if I had not warned him, though. I don't blame him for disbelieving me. It wasn't as though I had an ordinary kind of a haunting to tell him about. What happened to me began one morning when I woke up on the lawn behind my house. I was quite disoriented, as I remembered going to sleep in my bed in my house the night before. Looking toward my home, I could see that the window to my bedroom was wide open, as though I had crawled through it to go to sleep out in the backyard. What's more, I wasn't cold out there, even though it was a somewhat chilly morning. That to me said that I must not have been there for very long. What woke me wasn't the cold. It was the horrible smell. The odor in the yard was horrific, and I checked myself all over to make sure it wasn't me. I didn't isolate what was causing the smell. I just got up, went inside, and closed my bedroom window. I resolved to lock it before going to bed that night. Having had a normal day after that and being quite tired when I decided to hit the hay, I entirely forgot to lock my bedroom window. I do think I closed it, but I don't think I locked it. The next morning I woke up just as the sky was beginning to get its first tiny bit of morning light. It was very lovely, and I watched it for a while before realizing that I was watching it while laying on the grass out back once again. This time I was really freaked out when I sat up. This time, it wasn't just disorienting. It was extremely frightening. Had I been sleepwalking? That awful stench was back again, like an overflowing septic tank. What was going on? As I looked around myself in a state of panic, I caught 2 bright yellow eyes in the darkness off the side of my yard. I only saw it for a second, but it looked like a man with a dog's head. Not a wolf head, not a wolf man. This was a tall, well-built male figure with a dog-like head and glowing yellow eyes. I saw him turn quickly on his heels and run off into the woods, and I got up and ran as quickly as I could back into the house. Once again, the window in my bedroom was wide open. I closed it and locked it on the spot, and I went and did the same for every window in the house. I called my best friend on the phone to tell them what happened, but as I tried to form the sentences in my head, I realized I couldn't come up with any that didn't sound crazy. I had a problem, but I didn't know anyone I felt safe enough to confide in about it. I considered therapy or psychiatry, but I decided I'd better focus on making certain I didn't end up outside the house again by the next morning. I sat down and wrote up a checklist of things to do before bedtime to make sure there were no more repeats. First of all, I moved my bedroom upstairs. Second of all, I locked all the windows and doors. And third of all, I'd lock myself into my room at night. I knew the last one wasn't really foolproof, since after the first few nights, unlocking the door before leaving would probably become second nature to me, something I did unconsciously. I could easily unlock the door while sleepwalking, but I didn't know what else to do. I thought about hiding the key in a different spot each night, but I was afraid I'd forget where I put it and have to break my own door down to get out. Once I was satisfied that I was doing all I could to prevent myself from waking up on the lawn again, I looked online and made an appointment to see a therapist. "Doctor, I'm sleepwalking. Oh, and also I have a dogman staring at me. I wonder what kind of a prescription they give to sleepwalkers who see dogman also." Well, I figured I would soon find out. That night, I felt like strapping myself into my bed. I was so unnerved by what had been happening. When I finally fell asleep, I slept hard. But I was relieved to note that it was my pillow under my head and not Kentucky bluegrass. Also, I didn't smell anything bad, except my bedroom. But I was hearing something strange. It was an odd sound that had awakened me. It went on for some time, then it stopped, and my half-awake mind felt it was so familiar, something I knew I had a name for. After a few seconds, the sound started up again, and I sat up in bed, understanding that I was listening to a long, low howling. Either that or some kind of air raid siren. I rose and went to my window, even though I knew I wasn't going to see the source of that howling. And then, the very first thing I noticed when I looked out was the source of the howling. The same big dog-headed figure, lit by the moon, on a clearing on the raised land behind the woods. He was a tiny speck in the distance, but he was clearly that dog-headed man, the one with the glowing yellow eyes. I could see even from that distance that he was covered in fur, not clothing. It was not a man in the conventional sense. This was an animal that walked upright. It sent shivers through me, the savage vibe it gave off. As before, the dogman soon retreated back into the shadows, and I felt as though the situation was done for then. Sure enough, I noticed the sky changing colors and realized this had once again happened at dawn. Somehow the dogman was the reason I had awakened outside those 2 times. Had I actually sleepwalked? Or had I been moved there through some other means? I don't really have theories on that, by the way. Any ideas I've come up with seem silly. The dogman reached in the window and carried me out? The dogman levitated me out of the window? The dogman had Dr. McCoy teleport me onto the lawn? It seemed to me that the dogman must have been involved, but maybe he wasn't. Maybe I was sleepwalking at dawn, and he just found it interesting. I never slept in that house again. I still used it as my office and where I would eat for a while, but I would sleep at a motel or with friends or family. Eventually, I found a buyer like I told you, and now the place is just a memory to me. I moved completely over to the next state. I don't see why I should live in a place that has a nosy dogman who hypnotizes me or whatever it was he was doing. I plan on never again waking up to the dogman. This episode was made possible by a grant from today's executive producer, Kathy Barrickman. Take it, Will.
I'm talking about an EP named Kathy. She reads your mind with telepathy. What others can't do, she sure can. Because she's Kathy Barrickman.
Thanks, Will, and thank you, Kathy Barrickman. You are our first ever $10 channel member. That means you are watching this the day before everyone else. Let's talk about the other viewers while they're... Oh, no, wait, here they are. Hi, everybody. We were just saying how great you all are. If you would like to become a Scary Stories executive producer like the world-famous Kathy Barrickman, just click the join link below. We have a number of choices, starting as low as 99 cents, which will grant you access to our weekly secret uncensored stories that come out on Sunday nights. To thank Kathy for being a groundbreaker and a trendsetter, this next story is dedicated to her, and it is called I Can't Prove That a Werewolf Stole My Wife. Dear Scary Stories NYC, I have a story to tell you that happened in the middle of the pandemic situation's first wave some months back. I think it's a story about a werewolf, but it's also the story about how I lost my wife, Sylvia. It seems to me that the werewolf is the reason my wife is gone now, but I'm still in a mild state of shock over a month afterward, and I'm uncertain if my thinking is at all correct. Let me tell you things the way I remember them, and you can be the judge of my sanity and how much of this actually happened. First of all, I want to say that I was fully and completely in love with my wife, and I had thought she was equally happy with me. I almost never saw her without a smile on her face, and it felt like ours was an ongoing romance. But she's gone now. I guess she left me. I can't say I'm really 100% certain. The police say she's gone by her own choice. Her luggage was gone from her closet, some of her clothes were gone too. If she was kidnapped, they said, the kidnapper sure was polite. She didn't leave me a note. She didn't send me an email or even a text message to let me know where she was going or why she was leaving. Then again, maybe she figured I knew the answers to those questions already. Maybe I did and maybe I do, but maybe I just can't bring myself to say them out loud. One day during the spring, my wife and I took a walk in the woods behind our house. I guess it's ours. I mean, legally we're still married. Everything I own is half hers if she wants to reappear and take claim of it. Where was I? Oh, right, I was walking in the woods with my wife back when everything was still fine for us. We talked openly about how lucky we were to be able to enjoy the spring day with no masks on, since it was our own property that we were walking through. Some people were locked inside tiny apartments while we had free reign over acres of beautiful land on a warm, slightly muddy, nearly perfect day. And then we saw him there. I think my wife saw him first. I thought it was a bear or a Bigfoot, I swear. It was a big, tall, furry brown thing, and it was on our property. I remember how happy and comfortable and safe I had felt, and how quickly that drained away when I saw that we were not alone on our land. I then thought about how we really had no fencing around most of the property. Not only could animals from the nearby national forest wander in, but so could all sorts of cryptids, apparently. My wife had brought her binoculars with her, and she was trying to get a better view of the creature which was facing away from us. I could hear it walking again, and it sounded like it was walking toward us. I could no longer see it from my vantage point. I begged Sylvia to let me have the binoculars or to tell me what she was seeing. She waved me off with her left hand. I kept looking as I heard whatever it was approaching with heavy footsteps. Suddenly, and without warning, the moving mountain of brown fur burst through the underbrush, and I screamed and tried to run. Tripping on a tree root, I fell face first into the dirt, ending up with mud all over me. I looked back to see if the monster was coming for me, and I saw something that took me entirely by surprise. It wasn't a monster. At least, not in the sense of a Bigfoot. It was a really, really tall man, I guess about 6'6", and he was wearing a long brown fur coat, even though it was a warm spring day. He had long hair and a beard that covered his Barry Gibb-looking face. If you don't remember Barry Gibb, he was the singer that my grandmother used to be in love with back in the 70s and 80s. This guy was like a giant furry heartthrob, and he was already chatting up my wife with no face mask. They were definitely not 6 feet apart. I tried to pull myself up, leaning on an old rotting log that cracked under my weight, plunging my hand into a bunch of squirming things that caused me to have to deal with that instead of separating this furry giant from my wife. They both laughed at me there, covered in mud, wiping bugs off my hand. Before my wife introduced me to this Anunnaki giant, she actually joined him in laughing at my misfortune. Nothing like that had ever happened the entire time I'd known her. I felt stung in more ways than one. For some reason, I allowed Sylvia to invite this overly muscled pretty boy back to our house. I'm not even sure that was legal at the time. When we got back there, she asked him what he wanted, and then she made it for him by scratch. She had never done something like that for me. She told me she couldn't cook, so I had always made our meals when we ate together. The way she cooked for that guy was on a level far over my head. In fact, knowing now that she could whip up gourmet dishes like that, I don't even know how she could stomach my cooking. I'm very by the book, I just do what the recipe says. After the guy finally left, we had the first big argument of our marriage. First and last, I suppose. It was as though the person I thought I knew evaporated the second Captain Furcoat entered the picture. She agreed not to invite him over anymore, but she didn't seem too happy about it. After that, Sylvia insisted on doing our shopping alone, and she would take most of the day just to get some groceries. I knew what I was thinking was going on, but I had no proof. I thought about renting a car so I could follow her, or maybe hiring a private detective. When my stimulus check came, I actually priced both to see which would be more affordable. Okay, you're asking, what does this have to do with werewolves or dogmen? Well, this might seem like an entirely different story to you, but to me, this is a part of the same set of circumstances. I woke up one night to Sylvia coming back to bed around 4:18 a.m. She was taking off her overcoat and putting it in her closet as though she had been outside in her bedclothes. I decided not to say anything and to act as though I hadn't seen that. The next night I couldn't sleep, and at around 2:55 a.m., I heard a howling noise coming from outside. It sounded to me like Captain Furcoat. Could he be standing in my yard calling out to my wife? I leaped out of bed and I scampered to the window. Looking out, I saw an immense dog with glowing eyes sitting and howling at the edge of my backyard. It was standing just underneath the tree cover, and if it weren't for the eye shine, I might not have noticed it at all. It was looking up at the window I was looking out of, and when it saw me, it stood up on its hind legs, which caused me to gasp and react in shock, accidentally knocking down a lamp. It didn't break, but it made a loud thump when it hit the carpet in the bedroom. I looked toward Sylvia, and I was surprised to see she was already awake and watching me. She had an annoyed expression on her face. I started to tell her there was a big wolf-like dog outside and that it stood up on its hind legs, but she was out of the room and in the bathroom behind a slammed door before I could even finish the sentence. Not only was she not shocked to hear what I said, she wasn't even interested, and she seemed upset that I was. Looking back outside the window, I couldn't see the creature any longer. When she came back in the room, I began to try to explain, but she told me to be quiet and go back to bed. She never used to talk to me that way. It was like I was living with a different person. I had bad dreams that night. Everyone was laughing at me, and they were all whispering to each other. They would stop when they saw that I noticed, but when I would look away, they would go back to whispering about me and laughing at me. It was pretty horrible. By the time I had awakened, I knew on some level that my wife was cheating on me. I hadn't put all the pieces together yet, and maybe I still haven't, but something was going on that I didn't know how to stop. I decided to bake Sylvia a chocolate cake because that would always cheer her up before. Of course, I was the one who needed cheering up, but I didn't know what else to do. It turned out that she had already eaten all the chocolate chips I had stored up, so I had to go out to buy more. I was about to hop in the car when I remembered that the ancient general store in town had been allowed to stay open during the pandemic and they usually had chocolate chips in there. I decided to take the shortcut through the woods into the older part of town and give a local business my money. I felt like I was doing something good, and it distracted me from my worries of that moment. Well, once I was in the store, it was Old Home Week. 2 old ladies that used to be my teachers when I was a kid recognized me, and the store owner was glad to see me back as well. I got to talking with them all until I realized that the sun was going down, and I still had to cut back through the woods before it got too dark. There's no lighting in there, and I neglected to bring a flashlight. One of the ladies kindly offered me a lift, and I thought about taking her up on it. I was too embarrassed about the way Sylvia had been treating me, though. I didn't really want anyone I respected to catch a glimpse of the state my marriage had fallen into. In that town, we were still considered sort of newlyweds even though those days were gone. So, after bidding them all adieu, it was off on the path through the forest for me and my big bag of chocolate chips. I naively thought about how the extra thick chocolate cake I was going to make would restore the lost magic to my relationship with my wife. It was already much darker in the woods than I had expected it to be. I was getting the chills just being there, and I was moving twice as fast on the way back as I had on the way there. And then I heard that growling sound. It was like a monster from the movies kind of a growl, like King Kong. I looked it up afterward, and they played a lion backwards to make King Kong's roar. So maybe it sounded like a lion growling at me, something large. I turned around and I asked who was there, which is a dumb thing to do if you hear an animal sound. Was I expecting an apex predator to provide me with ID or something? And then I saw the shadowy silhouette of what I had first perceived to be a man emerging from the bushes. In fact, I perceived it to be one very specific man, the Barry Gibb-faced giant that I suspected my wife was cheating on me with. He seemed to be wearing the same fur coat as before. But then he took one more step, and I could see the outline of his head. He had pointy ears on top, like a cat or a dog, and he had eye shine, which a human cannot have. This was that dog I saw howling out back the prior night. He was standing on his hind legs again, only this time, he was walking on them. I stood there for a second or two trying to understand what was happening. Then he leaned over and began barking and growling in my face. I dropped the bag of chocolate and I ran. I ran for my life. My heart was so loud it sounded like it had moved up to between my ears. I only ran a short distance before I had to stop because I had already gotten really out of shape in the pandemic. I was gasping for air desperately and looking back to see how close the huge Dogman had gotten. I was stunned to see him with his head buried in my big bag of chocolates. He was eating my chocolate and ignoring me. I hoped chocolate was poisonous to dogs and I made my way home as fast as I could anyhow, which was not fast. When I got home, I was exhausted, but I ran to the pantry to see what other ingredients I might have around. Maybe I could make Sylvia something else. Even after all that, I was still thinking about her. Well, I made 3 kinds of pies that night, but Sylvia never came home. When I woke up in the morning, her side of the bed had not been slept in. I checked around, and her bags and luggage were still there. Her drawers were still full. I got panicked that she was in trouble. Or worse. I called her cell phone and got her recording, but the voicemail was turned off so that I couldn't leave a message. My first thought was to call the police, but instead, I ran out into the woods behind the house, calling her name. I walked back to the store in town, calling her name out into the forest. I asked at the store if they had seen her, and they had not. By late afternoon, the police had arrived and they listened to me at length. Then they asked if they could search our bedroom and I said fine. When they informed me that they couldn't find her luggage, I was stunned because I had seen it only hours earlier. I looked for myself though and they were right. Also, a lot of her clothes and personal items were missing. That meant she, or someone, had been there while I was out. To the police, That meant this was an open and shut case. She had left me. She had done it under her own power, and it was none of their business why she didn't respect me enough to leave a farewell note. I felt like the police were laughing at me too. Everyone was. It was pathetic. No, I was pathetic. My friends are sick of hearing from me. All I do is whine about how my wife left. I confided in some of them that I think she left me for a werewolf, and now those friends don't pick up when I call. I hear howling at 2 or 3 in the morning still, but now it sounds like 2 of them out there, singing in harmony with each other. I feel certain that I know what happened. I feel positive that nothing else could possibly explain it all. And yet, even so, I can't prove that a werewolf stole my wife.
The Dogman, Wavelength. Dear Scary Stories NYC. When I was in high school, I had a friend who I called Magic Alan. I could never tell if he was a great scientist or a great stage magician, because things would happen around Alan that appeared to be either one or the other. I couldn't tell if he was pranking me to see my reactions, or if he really was doing things based on some kind of advanced science. I wouldn't know how to debunk a scientist or a magician. Maybe Penn and Teller would have been able to tell me if this was all for real. The Magic Alan story I want to tell you about today is the craziest story of all. The time he claimed he had isolated the Dogman wavelength and that he was listening in on the Dogman transmissions. I heard his recordings. He had them stored on audio cassette after audio cassette, at least dozens of these taped recordings. They did sound a lot like dogs barking out some form of language. They were so staticky and warbly, though, that it could have been deep-voiced men speaking a foreign language with effects laid over it. It was interesting, but certainly inconclusive. To Magic Alan, though, these were recordings of interstellar communication by a species of dogmen from Sirius or someplace near there, and this was them talking with the dogmen they had stationed on Earth. He would go on telling me about the dogmen from space, but I was never sure if any of what he was spouting was supported by evidence. I wondered if he were just making it up as he went along, but he always sounded so certain of himself, and he seemed to have a prepared answer for any question I could throw at him. It's possible he was just that much smarter than I was. I do know he was, in fact, a brilliant guy. I just don't know if his talent was in science or salesmanship. Obviously, I wouldn't be telling you about any of this unless something bigger happened than old audio cassettes of growly-voiced people speaking on the so-called Dogman frequency. Magic Alan once actually showed me what appeared to be a real, living Dogman. We used to like to wander around the edge of town when we had time to goof off in those days. It was different on different days in that area, but we always found some place to be away from the crowds so that we could talk. Sometimes there would be an empty bench that we could spend the afternoon on. Other times, we'd play catch in an open field and talk there. We hiked through the woods outside of town to the diner the next town over on several occasions. There was never a set plan before we went out. We would just sort of wander past the usual haunts along the way, seeing which were busy with who, and we'd be having our day as we went along. On this one day, we had wandered off into the trees outside of town and meandered off the dirt trail in there as well. As long as the sun was still up, I felt confident that I could find my way home, so when the sun did start to set, I suggested we head back. We will in a minute or two, Alan said, staring off in the distance toward the east. He positioned himself behind a bush and motioned for me to take a spot near him. Quietly, he told me that it was probably going to start any minute. What was going to start any minute? He shrugged his shoulders and said he was only able to translate bits and pieces. So, while I had thought that we were wandering aimlessly talking about stuff that we found interesting, Magic Alan had actually been leading me all the time back to this place in the woods. This was all pre-planned by him. I wondered then and I wonder now if any of our earlier Saturdays had also been setups or if this was the first time. I kind of resented being tricked and used like this, brought to a spot for some unknown reason without being warned in advance, or asked if this was how I wanted to spend my afternoon. I was about to leave him there and walk home while I still could do so without getting lost in the dark, when Alan pointed with his left finger at the dark silhouette of a hairy, dog-headed, weightlifter kind of a guy standing at attention on the other side of this body of water we were peeking out at. I'm not clear on how far we were from the guy in the Dogman suit or possibly the real Dogman, but it was far enough away that it could have been a trick. It was not close enough to see the pulse pumping in its neck or to see its intricate movements. It was a shape. It seemed very large, but it had to have been the length of a baseball field away on the other side of a lake or a large pond. And then it became hard to see the dog-headed man. I squinted, but I could barely make it out, and then it seemed to be completely gone. That was a good trick, however Alan had done it, and I was about to tell him so. He tapped me on the shoulder before I could speak and motioned up in the sky, and I saw the most incredible array of flashing and rotating lights I had ever witnessed. It was apparently a flying saucer, or else the illusion of one, and I watched as it seemed to fly up and away. The lights became smaller until they disappeared. Either the craft flew off into space carrying the Dogman with it, as Alan seemed to expect me to believe, or else he had pulled off a very effective illusion. Remember, we were still in high school. This would have been hard or impossible for even the most brilliant teen to create, and I was the only one who was getting to see it. Why go through all that trouble just to mess with the mind of one guy? I'm not paranoid enough to think that I deserve that kind of attention from anyone. It seems easier to believe that it really was a ship from the Dog Star dropping by Earth to pick up a passenger. Then again, that's what stage magicians count on, us giving up and believing what they want us to believe. Alan got weirder after I left for college. When I would come back to town, I'd find him working on increasingly strange experiments. He never became social or grew to like girls or guys or anybody, and we kind of drifted apart. I don't know anyone who is still in touch with him, and he's too paranoid to use his real name on social media. I have never gathered any evidence that could either prove or disprove what I seem to have witnessed when I was with Magic Alan that night. So I still don't know if there really and truly exists a frequency known as the Dogman wavelength. Today's executive producer goes by the name of Helen. We wouldn't want to lose her because we think she's swellin'. All that kind of sort of stuff. Let's thank dear Helen Ivanoff. Thank you, Helen Ivanoff, for making this episode possible. Helen gets to see our secret uncensored stories that we put out each Sunday night. And so can you, if you join our paid subscribers club at peterbernard.com, or if you become a channel member by clicking the join link under this and every one of our videos. PQ Ribber will be back at the very end of this episode with more details, but right now, It's time for our second scary Dogman story of the day. This is a weird one that somebody claims he is telling us from memory. His memories seem to go back and forth between something he says really happened and a movie he claims he was watching just before the incident. Now, I love obscure old horror movies, but I don't recognize the one he's describing. Please tell me if you do, because I'm always stunned at how many old weird science fiction and horror movies I still haven't seen. If the movie he's talking about exists, I would very much like to see it for myself, because the film supposedly features a dogman in human clothing. Dear Scary Stories NYC. This happened to me in the late 80s or early 90s. I was going with a girl we can call Annabelle, which is not her real name. I only went with Annabelle from April Fool's Day in 1989 when we met, to my birthday in 1991 when she dumped me for my former best friend. That's how I know it happened during that time period. We were in some cabin in some state that she drove us to. The cabin belonged to someone in her family, I don't remember, and I didn't care at the time. I hadn't really wanted to go out to the country. I have an aversion to bugs that aren't roaches, I guess. Oh, right, the mosquitoes. That was what I complained about back then. Now, I look back on it, and I had a 22-year-old girl driving me to the country for a vacation, but I was complaining about it. Youth is wasted on Carl Jung, or however that old saying goes. So, what happened then? Oh, right. We watched movies that were in the cabin, and I stopped complaining for a while. There was a microwave, there was a freezer chest filled with those TV dinner type things. Like Hungry Man or Banquet, but whatever they were called back in those days. Those plastic plates with different partitions that each had their own kind of food in them. I really love that kind of thing for whatever reason. I like the brownies that you have to take out halfway through. I even like the mashed potatoes. Annabelle kept picking movies to watch, and I had never seen any of these before, so I just let her keep putting another on. I remember they had one of those ridiculously fragile old VHS machines that loaded from the top, the ones that would pop open hydraulically. I think they made them that way hoping they would all break and we'd have to buy new. I can hardly remember the movies we were watching, and I've never seen any of them again since. I think they were mainly dubbed into English, so who knows what the original titles were. There was one about a dogman who wore clothes. Possibly he was a werewolf who had been a human at one time, but if so, that must have happened in the prequel. In this movie, he was in the dogman form from beginning to end of the story, but he wore clothes the entire film too. He never went into a house to sleep in a bed. He lived in the forest in the wild. So, why was he wearing clothing? I remember he had a torn white shirt open to his fur-covered belly and tucked into his tight, knee-length pants. Under the pants, his hairy legs stuck out, ending in hairy humanoid feet with long, sharp, clawed toenails. It was kind of similar to that British Hammer werewolf movie with Oliver Reed, but this one's shirt wasn't ruffled. This was also the oldest movie I had seen where a werewolf has a dog-like head. I had seen movies of that type made in the late 70s through the 80s, I suppose, but this film appeared to be from the mid-60s. From a distance, you could sort of see that the wolf head mask wasn't real, but it still looked really creepy. For close-ups, they would cut to this tight close-up of a real dog, and then they'd cut back to the long shot of the guy with the dog head sticking out of his shirt. Even though it was cheesy, it was creeping me out, and it kind of had both of us in a bit of a trance. Bam! Something hit the front door of the cabin. We both almost peed ourselves. It was so loud and so unexpected. It sounded like maybe a rock or maybe a boot or maybe... I couldn't even imagine what had made that noise. I began to consider all the bad things that might happen if I went out front to see what that was. And I began to think of all the bad things that might happen if I didn't. Neither of us were armed, and we wouldn't have known what to do with weapons if we had them. We both sat there, unmoving, with looks on our faces as though we were waiting until just the right moment to react. Crash! The front window of the cabin burst in. What was that? I looked around on the floor. A few things had been knocked off a shelf when the window burst in, and I couldn't remember which was there before and which might have come in through the window. Annabelle screamed, "Let's go," and ran out the front door. I protested, since I thought she was running out there to battle whoever was doing this. She was not. She was making a run for the car so that we could drive away from the cabin. She had not articulated that to me because it would seem to be a quite obvious thing that you wouldn't have to point out. I watched my girlfriend run out the front door where I knew there was somebody doing stuff, probably throwing stuff. I didn't want to go out there. I wanted to hide until whoever this was left. Smash! A fist burst through the window shades to my right, barely missing my ear. It was a hairy fist attached to a very long, very hairy arm, and it withdrew with the obvious intent of punching back in again far more harshly than the previous time. "Bigfoot!" I screeched, and I ran out the front door, catching up to and passing Annabelle on the way to the car. It wasn't until I was locked inside in the passenger seat with my seatbelt on that I looked back at the house, scanning with my eyes to locate the Bigfoot whose arm I had seen. Well, you can probably guess already. That wasn't a Bigfoot at all. That was a Dogman, and he had caught sight of our attempt to escape. It began to walk bipedally in our direction with a most determined expression on its face. I heard Annabelle cursing, so I assumed she saw the same thing I saw. The creature had the largest dog head I had ever seen, over this steroid freak muscle man kind of a body. The fur on it was long enough to blow in the breeze as it walked, even though it seemed knotted and matted and caked together in places. It looked like it smelled bad. Annabelle fumbled with her keys, and I shouted at her to calm down. I remember that specifically, because every time she wanted to criticize me for the rest of the time I knew her, she would say, "Why don't you shout at me to calm me down again?" Eventually, she did get the car started, and we skidded out of there with the creature following us. We would pass into shade and then better lit areas as we drove down the bumpy dirt road back to the highway, so I would see the Dogman in different light nearly every second. When it was in the complete dark, I could still see its eyes, which glowed a yellowish-white color. When it moved into the light, I could briefly see how filthy it was. It looked like it had been rolling in its own... well, let's just say it looked nasty. I've heard stories of people being awed by the beauty of the Dogman, and I've heard the ones where people talk about an unnatural fear of them. Well, I think the most outstanding characteristic of this particular Dogman was that it was really putrid. In fact, I'm surprised I didn't smell it outside the window when its fist nearly connected that time. It was standing a few feet from me, and yet my nose did not notice that it was. I have no explanation for that except that maybe it was God granting me a small grace. I will have the sickening appearance of that monster burned into my mind until I'm gone. But at least I don't have to remember what it smelled like. At first, the creature pursued us almost desperately, looking like his life depended on catching up to our car. I began reciting the Lord's Prayer. That's how bad it was starting to look for us for a minute there. You know how in a lot of Dogman stories, people in vehicles say that the creature ran fast on two legs, then dropped to all fours and became much faster? Well, when Annabelle got us up past a certain speed, the creature just kept running on its hind legs, and we were able to pull away. Although it had behaved so fiercely in the beginning of the chase, it no longer seemed as though he was really trying to catch us. It mostly seemed that he was chasing us out and making sure we left. Maybe he wanted to watch that weird dog-headed werewolf movie that I never got to see the end of. By the way, if you know what the title of that was, please leave it in the comments, as I'd love to see how the story turns out in the end after all these years. At any rate, the dogman we saw also had tattered clothing on it, at least possibly. It might have been knots in its fur, or some kind of plant life he had been sleeping nearby, but there were pieces of what looked from a distance like textiles or clothing on the top half of him. Annabelle thought it was a werewolf, not a dogman. She was certain that we were seeing the remnants of the clothing it wore the last time it was human. Maybe it was because we had just been watching that odd-dubbed movie about the dogman who wore clothes, but I don't think that creature we saw had a human intelligence. I think it was a dogman full-time, not a werewolf. I talked to a couple of guys in a bar one night who were fairly into the whole dogman thing. They asked me if the creature had opposable thumbs, and if it really threw stuff at the cabin. Those are two different questions. First of all, what I saw barely missing my head looked like a fist. It seems likely that the creature had a hand with a thumb, if it could make a fist, but I do not remember consciously seeing a thumb in the heat of the moment. As to whether the dogman was capable of throwing objects, I can't say for sure because I never saw what caused the window to smash. Could the dogman have punched the window to smash it, the way I saw him do to the shades? Yeah, that's definitely something that might have happened. It could have punched or kicked the front door, and then the window. From our angle, watching the TV on the floor, we wouldn't have had a clear view in either case. So, what did we see? I think it was a dogman, but Annabelle insisted it was wearing ripped-up clothes, so she said werewolf. I think that whatever we saw on its fur, it only seemed like clothing to us, because of the movie we had just been watching, in which we saw a dogman in human clothing.
Thanks for watching till the end. If you liked what you saw, please consider clicking like on the video or sharing it. You can become a channel member by clicking the join link below. Then you can check our community page to find the links to 10 hours or more of secret, uncensored Dogman stories too wild to be told on this channel. Your other option is to join our paid subscribers club at peterbernard.com. That's Peter's homemade club, where he will personally email you the links as well as occasional secret club messages. You may also be included as an executive producer in a future episode. You have a scary experience you want to tell us about? You can email us at scarystoriesnyc@gmail.com, or else call our Scary Stories voicemail hotline at 804-LESS-SCARY. The machine cuts off every few minutes, so if you have a long story, please keep calling back and we'll piece it together later on. Good night, and have a scary tomorrow.
Come back for more scary stories.